Dr. Mia Carter adjusted her gloves, the sterile fabric taut against her fingers as she worked to stabilize the injured passenger on the stretcher. The low hum of the humanitarian vessel, Endeavor, was usually a soothing backdrop, but today it carried an undercurrent of tension. A routine aid mission to an outer colony had been disrupted by disturbing reports of Braxian activity nearby. The Braxian were notorious, ruthless conquerors who saw humans as little more than nuisances to be eradicated or exploited. Mia felt the familiar knot in her stomach tighten as she moved with precision, her training taking precedence over her unease. She'd chosen this life to save others, even in the face of danger, but the thought of an actual encounter with the Braxian left her uneasy. Vitals stabilizing, she muttered, her tone brisk but reassuring, though it wasn't clear if the words were meant for her patient or herself. She glanced at the others in the cramped medical bay, 2 nurses and a technician, before turning back to her work. They all wore the same tension on their faces. A shudder ran through the ship, a sudden, jarring tremor that knocked a tray of instruments to the floor. Mia froze, her hands stilling. The lights flickered, and the alarm system blared, flooding the room with crimson light. "They've found us," someone whispered, barely audible over the wailing klaxon. The announcement over the intercom confirmed their worst fears. "Braxian ships have breached our perimeter. All personnel, prepare for emergency protocols." Before Mia could process the full weight of the message, the ship was rocked by another impact. This time, the lurch threw her off balance, and she grabbed the stretcher to steady herself. The medical bay erupted into chaos as nurses scrambled to secure equipment and patients. "Mia, we have to go," a technician urged, tugging at her arm. She shook her head. "Not yet. Help me move him." She motioned toward the patient on the stretcher. Together, they managed to wheel him toward the emergency escape pod corridor, but the effort was cut short as the bulkhead doors hissed open. Through the smoke and sparks, towering figures emerged. The Braxian. Their sleek, iridescent armor reflected the flickering emergency lights, and their segmented, insect-like eyes scanned the room with clinical detachment. Mia's heart pounded as she took in their inhuman forms, sharp mandibles, elongated limbs, and an unsettling, almost mechanical precision to their movements. "Stay back," one of the nurses screamed, but the Braxian soldiers didn't flinch. In a flash, they were upon them. Mia barely had time to react before a pair of hands yanked her away from the stretcher. The grip was crushing, her protests muffled as another Braxian silenced her with a cold, metallic clamp over her mouth. Around her, the scene dissolved into chaos, shouts, the clatter of equipment, and the muffled cries of her crewmates as they were subdued one by one. She struggled, her mind racing for a way to escape, but the Braxian's strength was overwhelming. As she was dragged through the corridors, she caught glimpses of the devastation. The ship's interior, once a hub of life-saving operations, was now a smoldering ruin. The Braxian herded the captives into a holding area, a harshly lit chamber lined with energy restraints. Mia's pulse raced as she was shoved into place, the restraints snapping around her wrists and ankles. The other survivors were similarly immobilized, their expressions a mix of fear and defiance. A Braxian officer, taller and more imposing than the others, stepped forward. His voice was a grating mixture of clicks and guttural tones, but the translator embedded in his armor rendered his words into chilling clarity. "Humans, weak, fragile, and yet persistent. You continue to meddle in matters beyond your station. No more." His gaze swept over the group, finally settling on Mia. He tilted his head, studying her with an almost clinical curiosity. "This one is different. A healer." Mia met his gaze, refusing to flinch. Her heart thundered, but she kept her expression steady. If they saw her fear, they might exploit it. The officer motioned to 2 guards. "Throw her into the containment cell with the beast. Let her tend to that abomination if she dares." Before Mia could protest, she was hauled to her feet and dragged down a long corridor. The guards exchanged glances, their mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement or disdain. She tried to pull away, but the grip on her arms tightened, making it clear that resistance was futile. The corridor ended at a massive, reinforced door. It hissed open, revealing a cell shrouded in dim light and a palpable sense of menace. The air was heavy with the metallic tang of blood and something primal, something feral. Mia's captors shoved her inside, the force of the motion sending her stumbling forward. She caught herself just before hitting the ground and turned to face the door as it slammed shut with a resounding clang. The sound of her own breathing filled the silence, but she wasn't alone. From the shadows at the far end of the cell, a pair of glowing eyes emerged. They locked onto her with predatory intensity, unblinking and fierce. Mia's breath hitched as the creature stepped into the light. It was massive, its form a terrifying blend of humanoid and lupin features. Thick fur covered its muscular frame, and its claws clicked against the metal floor with every step. A deep scar slashed across its chest, and its movements were stiff, as if it had been injured recently. She stood frozen, her mind screaming at her to do something. Anything, but her body refused to obey. The creature stopped a few paces away, its head tilting slightly as it regarded her. And then it growled. It wasn't a mindless snarl, but something deeper, laced with intelligence and warning. For a fleeting moment, Mia thought she saw a flicker of something human in its eyes, a shadow of emotion buried beneath the feral exterior. Summoning every ounce of courage she had left, she straightened her spine and met its gaze. "If you're going to kill me, get it over with," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. The creature's growl subsided, replaced by a low rumble that might have been amusement. It didn't attack. Instead, it stepped back, retreating into the shadows. Mia exhaled, the tension in her body releasing just enough for her to think clearly. She wasn't dead yet, but survival in this cell was far from guaranteed. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. Whatever the Braxian had thrown her into, it wasn't just a cell. It was a test, and she wasn't about to fail. The cell was quiet, but not peacefully so. It was the kind of silence that bristled with tension, thick with the unspoken promise of violence. Mia stood still, her back pressed against the cold, metallic wall. The faint hum of the containment field that sealed the cell seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heart. She knew better than to assume she was safe. The creature that shared her prison had retreated into the shadows, but its presence was palpable. Her gaze flicked to the far corner, where the faint glow of those piercing eyes still lingered. They watched her, unblinking and predatory, but there was no immediate movement. She could feel her breathing grow shallow, the ache in her chest reminding her that panic would do her no good. She closed her eyes briefly, forcing herself to take slow, deliberate breaths. The creature moved. It was subtle at first, a faint shuffle, the sound of claws scraping against the floor, but it was enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through her system. When she opened her eyes, it was closer. The dim light glinted off its thick fur, now visible in patches where the shadows didn't conceal it. Mia's instinct screamed at her to run, but logic overrode the impulse. There was nowhere to go. The Braxian hadn't thrown her in here as an act of mercy. This was a death sentence, one designed to entertain or test some cruel theory. The creature stopped just short of striking distance. Up close, it was even larger than she'd realized. Its lupin features were harsh, a powerful muzzle lined with sharp teeth, and its shoulders rippled with muscle beneath its fur. But what struck her most was the scar that carved through its chest, exposing damaged flesh that hadn't fully healed. It growled again, low and deep, the sound reverberating through her bones. Mia held her ground, refusing to cower. Instead, she focused on the scar. It was inflamed, the tissue poorly mended, and around the edges, she spotted signs of infection. Without thinking, her professional instincts kicked in. "You're hurt," she said, her voice steady despite the tension that coiled in her stomach. "That's infected. If it isn't treated, you'll get septic." The creature's growl faltered, replaced by something more akin to a grunt. It tilted its head, the motion deliberate, almost calculating, as if her words had reached some part of it capable of understanding. Mia took a cautious step forward, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm a medic. Let me help." The creature let out a sharp snarl, and she froze. Its eyes narrowed, and for a moment, she thought she'd overstepped. But it didn't lunge. Instead, it shifted slightly, sitting back on its haunches, though its muscles remained coiled, ready to strike if she made a wrong move. She took the silence as permission and edged closer. Her pulse thundered in her ears, but she forced herself to remain calm. Each step brought her closer to the reality of its injuries. The scar wasn't just deep, it was jagged, as though inflicted by something designed to tear rather than cut cleanly. Kneeling a safe distance away, she rummaged through the small emergency kit strapped to her belt. It wasn't much, just a few basic tools and supplies, but it would have to do. "You're a survivor," she said, more to fill the silence than anything else. "That wound should have killed you. Whatever they did to you, it didn't break you." The creature let out a soft huff, a sound that could have been agreement or dismissal. Either way, it didn't move as she began to work. With careful precision, she sprayed a disinfectant over the inflamed tissue, watching for any reaction. Its body tensed but didn't lash out. "You've been through hell," she murmured. "But so have I." The words slipped out before she could stop them. She didn't expect a response, but she thought she saw its ears twitch, a subtle acknowledgement that caught her off guard. As she cleaned the wound, she risked glancing up at its face. Those eyes were still fixed on her, intense and unwavering, but there was something new in their depths. Curiosity. "You understand me, don't you?" she asked softly. The creature didn't answer, but its head tilted slightly again, as though considering her question. Mia's hands stilled for a moment. If it understood, even partially, it meant there was more to it than the savage killer the Braxian wanted her to believe it was. She resumed her work, this time with a gentler touch, as if her actions could convey what words couldn't. "I'm Mia," she said after a pause. "Dr. Mia Carter. And you?" It let out a low rumble, not quite a growl, but not a word either. Still, it was progress. The tension in the air had shifted. The initial hostility had ebbed, replaced by a fragile truce. Mia finished dressing the wound and sat back on her heels, giving the creature space. "There," she said, gesturing to her work. "It's not perfect, but it'll hold. Better than letting it fester. Anyway." The creature stared at her for a long moment, its expression unreadable. Then, to her astonishment, it inclined its head slightly, a gesture so human it left her momentarily speechless. Before she could process it further, a distant clanging echoed through the walls of the cell. It was faint but growing louder. The Braxian were coming back. The creature's ears pricked, and its body tensed, readying itself for whatever was coming. Mia felt her own pulse quicken. She didn't know what the Braxian had planned next, but she doubted it would be anything good. She looked at the creature, meeting its gaze once more. There was no fear in its eyes, only a fierce, unyielding resolve. For the first time since being thrown into this cell, Mia felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The metallic clang of approaching boots echoed louder, reverberating through the walls of the cell. Mia's pulse quickened, but her gaze remained steady on the creature before her. It hadn't moved from its crouched position, but its ears twitched at the sound, and its claws flexed against the floor. Every line of its body radiated tension, a predator on the edge of springing into action. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic pounding. The creature didn't respond, but its glowing eyes shifted toward the cell door. Mia could feel the energy in the room shift, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever bond they'd forged in those first tenuous moments was about to be tested. The door hissed open, and 3 Braxian soldiers stepped inside, their segmented eyes scanning the cell. The lead soldier, bulkier than the others, carried a long, serrated weapon that hummed faintly with lethal energy. "The beast appears docile," one of them remarked in their harsh, translated tone, though its mandibles clicked with disdain. "Perhaps the human has calmed it." "Curious." Mia straightened, forcing herself to meet their gaze, even as every instinct screamed at her to look away. "What do you want with me?" she demanded, keeping her voice as firm as she could. The lead soldier tilted its head, a chilling mimicry of curiosity. You are here to prove your value, human. Either you make the beast useful, or you both perish. The implications hit her like a blow, but before she could reply, the creature let out a deep, guttural snarl that silenced the room. The soldiers turned their attention back to it, and for the first time, Mia saw hesitation in their movements. The Braxton were technologically superior, but they had always been wary of their own creations. This creature, whatever it was, had clearly been designed to be more dangerous than they anticipated. The lead soldier barked a command in its native tongue, and the others raised their weapons. The hum of energy filled the air, and Mia's stomach churned. She had seconds to act. "Stop!" she shouted, stepping forward with a boldness she didn't entirely feel. "You'll kill it if you attack like that." And then what? Another failed experiment? The soldiers hesitated, their attention flicking between her and the creature. "I can stabilize it," she continued, her mind racing. "I can make it stronger, better, but not if you kill it now." The leader's mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "And what incentive do we have to trust you, human?" She forced herself to smile grimly. "Because if you don't, you'll lose your prize. And if I die, you'll never know if it could have been controlled." The silence stretched, taut and oppressive. Finally, the lead soldier lowered its weapon slightly. "Very well, but you will remain under constant surveillance. If you fail, your life is forfeit." Mia barely had time to process the partial victory before the soldiers retreated, the door sealing shut behind them. The tension in her body didn't ease. She turned back to the creature, whose gaze was fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "Guess that makes us partners," she said softly, more to herself than to it. The creature huffed, a sound that could have been irritation or amusement, before retreating to the far side of the cell. Over the next few hours, Mia worked in silence, taking stock of her limited supplies and trying to formulate a plan. The Braxton would be watching for results, but she had no intention of making their lives easier. If she could gain the creature's trust and its cooperation, they might have a chance to escape. She glanced up to find it watching her again. Its gaze was unervingly steady, as if it were studying her every move. "You understand me, don't you?" she asked, not expecting an answer. To her surprise, the creature let out a low rumble, almost like a growl but softer. It wasn't a confirmation, but it wasn't a denial either. Encouraged, Mia leaned forward. "I know they've hurt you. I've seen what they're capable of, but we don't have to let them win." The creature tilted its head, the movement slow and deliberate. It shifted closer, its massive form moving with a grace that seemed impossible for something its size. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady. "If we work together, we might be able to get out of here. But I need to know I can trust you." It paused, as if considering her words. Then, to her astonishment, it nodded. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a surge of hope through her. She reached into her kit and pulled out a small vial of painkillers. Holding it up, she said, "This will help with the pain. If you let me, I can make it easier for you to fight." The creature hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing. Slowly, it lowered itself to the ground, resting on its haunches as if granting her permission. Mia approached cautiously, every step measured. She knelt beside it, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Carefully, she injected the painkillers near the edge of its wound, watching for any signs of aggression. The creature flinched but didn't lash out. Instead, it let out a low sigh, its massive frame relaxing slightly. "There," she said softly, pulling back. "That should help for now." The creature regarded her for a long moment, its expression unreadable. Then, it did something that startled her. It lowered its head, a gesture of acknowledgement or perhaps even gratitude. Mia exhaled, her shoulders sagging with relief. For the first time since her capture, she felt a flicker of control over her circumstances. "All right," she murmured, more to herself than to the creature. "We'll play their game for now. But when the time comes, we'll make our move." The creature rumbled again, a sound that felt almost like agreement. They weren't free yet, but for the first time, Mia felt like she wasn't alone in the fight. Together, they might just have a chance to survive and to strike back against the ones who had thrown them into this hell. The following days passed in a strange rhythm, a tense balance of observation, planning, and survival. The Braxian rarely interfered, their cold, segmented eyes visible only through the transparent panel at the cell's edge. Mia felt their gaze constantly upon her, dissecting her every move, every decision. It was a performance, she realized, and one they expected her to fail. The creature, however, became an unexpected ally in this game. Its intelligence was undeniable. Though it couldn't speak, its actions spoke volumes. When she explained her plans or showed her intent through gestures and expressions, it responded with a clarity that astonished her. Each day, they forged an unspoken bond, their shared predicament bridging the gap between species. "Today's the day," she murmured, her voice low as she examined the thick bands of scar tissue across the creature's chest. The infection had subsided, the flesh knitting together in a way that suggested its resilience was more than natural. Whatever enhancements the Braxian had grafted into its DNA had made it stronger, faster, but they hadn't accounted for its ability to reason. The creature rumbled softly, its luminous eyes watching her with an intensity that no ordinary beast could muster. Mia wasn't sure if it understood her words, but it seemed to grasp the meaning behind them. She moved to the cell's edge, glancing at the faint outline of the Braxian guards beyond. Their silhouettes blurred behind the energy field, but she could feel their presence, cold and calculating. They were waiting for her to fail. "They'll come soon," she said, turning back to the creature. "They want a demonstration, something to prove you're worth keeping alive, or worth dissecting for parts." Her stomach churned at the thought, but she forced herself to stay composed. The creature growled low, a sound that sent a shiver through the air. It wasn't fear. It was anger, a raw, simmering fury that Mia found herself sharing. "They think they've won," she continued, her voice steadier now. "That we're just pieces on their board. But they've underestimated both of us." The creature's head tilted slightly, its ears flicking forward as if listening intently. Mia knelt beside it, lowering her voice further. "When they come in, we'll give them their show. But on our terms." The plan wasn't perfect, far from it. Her supplies were limited, her knowledge of the Braxian's technology fragmentary at best. But desperation had a way of sharpening the mind, and she'd spent every waking moment devising a way to exploit their arrogance. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor, the unmistakable rhythm of the Braxian guards approaching. Mia's heart raced, but she kept her expression neutral, her body poised. The creature stood, its massive form looming beside her like a shadow. There was no hesitation in its movements, only a quiet readiness that mirrored her own resolve. The door hissed open, and 3 Braxian entered, their metallic armor gleaming under the harsh cell lights. The leader, the same bulky figure from before, carried a device that hummed with ominous energy. "It is time," the Braxian said, its voice a guttural rasp. "Prove your worth, human, or face the consequences." Mia nodded, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "Fine, but if you want results, you'll follow my instructions. No interruptions." The leader's mandibles clicked in irritation, but it gestured for her to proceed. The other guards stood ready, their weapons trained on the creature. Mia stepped forward, her hands raised as if addressing both the Braxian and the creature. "We'll start with a simple test," she said, her tone calm but authoritative. "You want to see its strength, its speed? Then let it show you." She turned to the creature, locking eyes with it. This was the moment, the delicate balance between trust and chaos. "Go," she whispered, the single word carrying all the weight of their unspoken understanding. The creature moved. It was a blur of motion, a seamless blend of power and precision that left even the Braxian momentarily stunned. It lunged not at the guards, but at the energy field surrounding the cell. Its claws raked against the barrier, sparks flying as the force of its strike reverberated through the chamber. The Braxian shouted, their weapons raising instinctively, but Mia stepped between them and the creature. "Wait," she snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos. "It's testing the limits of its environment. Isn't that what you wanted? To see how it thinks, how it strategizes? The leader hesitated, its segmented eyes narrowing. Continue, it said, though its tone carried a warning. The creature turned back toward the guards, its massive frame radiating controlled aggression. It paced slowly, deliberately, each movement measured as though assessing its adversaries. Mia could see the tension in the guards' stances, their grips tightening on their weapons. She moved closer to the creature, her hands steady despite the hammering of her heart. "Show restraint," she murmured, just loud enough for it to hear. The creature stopped, its head tilting slightly. Then, in a move so deliberate it could only be intentional, it sat back on its haunches, its glowing eyes fixed on the lead Braxian. The leader stepped forward, its mandibles clicking in irritation. "This display is insufficient. You waste our time, human." Mia held her ground, her mind racing. She needed more time, just a few more moments, to push the Braxian's overconfidence to its breaking point. "You think it's a waste because you don't understand what you're seeing," she said, her voice cold. "This isn't a mindless weapon. It's something more. And if you kill it before realizing that, you'll have lost the only advantage you've ever created." The Braxian's gaze shifted to the creature, then back to her. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air, and Mia wondered if she'd overplayed her hand. Then, the leader stepped back, signaling to the other guards to lower their weapons. "You have one more opportunity, human. Impress us, or you will both be discarded." The door hissed shut behind them, leaving Mia and the creature alone once more. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her legs threatening to buckle beneath her. The creature moved closer, its eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that felt almost human. "That was too close," she muttered, running a hand through her hair. The creature rumbled softly, a sound that felt almost like agreement. Mia sank to the floor, her mind already racing ahead. The Braxian had given them a reprieve, but it wouldn't last. Whatever she did next had to count, and this time, there would be no room for mistakes. The hours after the Braxian departed were a blur of activity. Mia worked tirelessly, her mind churning through the sparse resources at her disposal. Every movement, every choice, was driven by the understanding that their survival hinged on the next encounter. The creature remained close, its presence an anchor amidst the whirlwind of her thoughts. She adjusted the small device she had cobbled together from discarded scraps, a rudimentary signal disruptor, though its effectiveness was far from guaranteed. It was a gamble, but every second spent tinkering brought her closer to something functional. "You'll have to trust me," she murmured, glancing at the creature. Its gaze never wavered, its glowing eyes fixed on her hands as if it understood the stakes as clearly as she did. The tension between them was no longer fraught with mistrust, but had settled into something quieter, more cohesive. They were partners now, bound by necessity and an unspoken agreement that neither would survive alone. She set the device aside and leaned back, rubbing her temples. "If this works, it'll cut their surveillance for a few minutes, maybe less. We'll have to move fast." The creature's ears twitched, its body tensing as though readying itself for action. It had barely rested since their first confrontation with the Braxian, its focus as unrelenting as Mia's. A faint hum began to rise in the cell, almost imperceptible at first, but growing steadily louder. Mia's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the room. "They're coming," she whispered, her pulse quickening. The creature rose to its full height, its muscles coiling with anticipation. There was no need for words between them now. They both knew what was at stake. The door slid open, and two Braxian soldiers entered, their weapons drawn and their movements deliberate. Behind them, a third figure followed, the leader, its segmented eyes glittering with what Mia could only describe as malice. "The time for games has ended," the leader rasped. "You will prove the creature's worth now, or you will both be eliminated." Mia stood her ground, her chin lifting defiantly. "Fine, but if you want results, you'll stay out of my way." No interruptions this time. The leader's mandibles clicked in irritation, but it gestured for the soldiers to step aside. "Proceed," it said coldly. Mia turned to the creature, her heart pounding as she gave the subtlest of nods. It responded immediately, its body a blur of motion as it lunged, not at the Braxian, but toward the far wall of the cell. Its claws struck the metal with a force that sent a deafening crack reverberating through the chamber. "What is the meaning of this?" the leader demanded, its voice sharp with suspicion. "Analysis," Mia replied smoothly, forcing calm into her tone. "It's testing the structural integrity of its environment." "You said you wanted to see how it thinks." The leader hesitated, its gaze shifting between Mia and the creature. "Continue," it said finally, though its tone was laced with warning. Mia stepped closer to the device she had hidden among her tools, her fingers brushing against its edge. With a single press, she activated it. The hum of the surveillance systems faltered, the energy field surrounding the cell flickering briefly before stabilizing. The leader's eyes narrowed. "What have you done?" "Adaptation," Mia said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You wanted results, didn't you? This is part of the process." Before the Braxian could respond, the creature moved again, its massive form a whirlwind of motion. It struck at the guards with precise, calculated force, disarming them before they could react. The weapons clattered to the ground, and the soldiers stumbled back, their segmented eyes wide with alarm. The leader roared, its mandibles flaring as it reached for its own weapon. But Mia was faster. She grabbed one of the fallen rifles and aimed it squarely at the Braxian's chest. "Don't," she said, her voice firm. "This ends here." The leader froze, its gaze locking onto hers with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "You think you can escape?" it hissed. "You are nothing but prey." "Maybe," Mia replied, her grip tightening on the rifle. "But even prey can fight back when it has nothing left to lose." The creature growled low, stepping beside her as if to reinforce her words. Together, they were an imposing sight, a united front against their captors. For a moment, the air was thick with tension, the standoff balanced on a knife's edge. Then, with a sudden burst of motion, the creature lunged at the leader, knocking it to the ground. The rifle clattered from Mia's hands, but she didn't hesitate. She grabbed the disruptor and hurled it at the energy field. The device sparked and hissed, the force field collapsing in a shower of light. "Move!" she shouted, and the creature didn't need to be told twice. They sprinted through the open doorway, the sounds of chaos erupting behind them as the remaining Braxians scrambled to respond. Mia's heart thundered in her chest, but she forced herself to focus, her mind racing as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors. "This way," she called, leading the creature down a narrow passage. The lights flickered overhead, the disruptor's effects rippling through the Braxian systems. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder, the clatter of armored footsteps echoing off the walls. "We need to find a way out," Mia said, glancing back at the creature. It rumbled in response, its gaze scanning their surroundings with unnerving precision. As they rounded a corner, a blast of energy sizzled past them, striking the wall inches from Mia's head. She ducked instinctively, her pulse spiking as she pressed forward. The creature growled, its claws raking against the floor as it surged ahead. It turned abruptly, slamming into a control panel with enough force to shatter it. The lights dimmed further, the hum of the facility's systems faltering. Mia skidded to a stop beside it, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Good thinking," she said, sparing it a fleeting glance of gratitude. But their reprieve was short-lived. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, and Mia knew they were running out of time. "This isn't over," she muttered, clutching the rifle tightly. The creature growled low, its glowing eyes meeting hers with a fierce determination. Together, they turned and sprinted into the unknown, the promise of freedom driving them forward even as the weight of their enemies bore down on them. The hallways blurred as Mia and the creature raced deeper into the labyrinthine complex. Her breath came in ragged gasps, the sound of their footsteps reverberating in the oppressive silence that followed the chaos of the last few moments. Every corner they turned seemed to lead to another dead end, yet the flicker of hope kept her pushing forward. She wasn't sure how much time they had left before the Braxian caught up, but she knew that the clock was ticking. The creature, at her side, moved with an ease that seemed almost supernatural, its powerful limbs covering the distance effortlessly. Its eyes flickered with intelligence, constantly scanning their surroundings, anticipating danger before it fully materialized. Mia felt a strange comfort in its presence. In this world of cold, mechanical efficiency, the creature was her only ally, and it was proving itself capable in ways that surpassed her expectations. They reached an intersection, the cold lights above casting long shadows down the sterile, metallic corridors. Mia paused, scanning for signs of movement. There was no time to be subtle now. If they didn't find an exit soon, they'd be trapped, cornered by the Braction. "What now?" she murmured, more to herself than to the creature. It stopped beside her, its head tilting slightly, ears flicking in every direction. She had no way of knowing if it understood her words, but the silent communication between them had become instinctive. The creature lowered its body, as if preparing for something. Suddenly, a distant sound, a chorus of shrill Braction commands, echoed down the corridor. Mia's pulse spiked. They were close. She ran her hands over the walls, searching for anything that could be used to her advantage. The walls were smooth, the surface metallic and unyielding, but then she felt a subtle vibration under her fingertips, a panel slightly loose. With a sense of urgency, she dug her fingers into the gap, pulling. It gave way, revealing a small access point. "I knew it," she breathed, her eyes lighting up with the first glimmer of real hope she'd felt since they'd been thrown together in this hellhole. "Come on," she urged the creature, already pulling herself through the opening. The creature followed without hesitation, its massive frame fitting with surprising ease through the access tunnel. The sounds of the Braction were growing louder, the soldiers' voices sharpening in anger as they no doubt realized the escape was underway. Mia crawled quickly, feeling the cool, recycled air circulate through the narrow passage. She had no idea where it led, but it had to be better than where they had been. Her fingers burned with the effort, but she couldn't afford to stop. The creature was just behind her, moving with a fluid grace that sent a shiver down her spine. Minutes passed like hours as they navigated the dark, claustrophobic tunnel. Mia's chest tightened with every footstep that echoed from above, but she refused to look back. The creature's presence behind her was a constant reassurance, an unspoken promise that she wasn't alone in this fight. They reached a small hatch, its surface battered but intact. She shoved at it with all her strength, finally managing to open it just enough to slip through. The creature followed, emerging into a room that looked nothing like the sterile corridors they'd just fled. It was dark, and the air was thick with dust, but the smell of fresh oxygen, of the outside world, was unmistakable. Mia let out a quiet, relieved breath as she straightened, glancing around. They were in some kind of storage chamber, filled with crates and supplies that looked like they had been untouched for years. "There has to be a way out," she whispered, her voice almost reverent in the stillness of the room. The creature didn't respond, but moved to the far side of the chamber, its glowing eyes scanning the surroundings with quiet precision. Mia followed, her mind working quickly to piece together their next move. If they could find a way to disable the Braction surveillance network, or better yet, their entire facility, they might just have a chance at escaping. Then she saw it, a small window, high up on the wall, barely visible behind a stack of crates. She smiled to herself, adrenaline surging. "This is it," she muttered. With a grunt of effort, she began moving crates, her arms aching, but her resolve unwavering. The creature remained silent, watching, its eyes flickering between Mia and the window. It was close now, the faintest glint of moonlight filtering through the glass. Mia managed to clear the area, stepping back to survey her progress. The creature stepped forward, its claws easily reaching the window, though it hesitated before making contact. For a moment, Mia felt the weight of the decision that hung in the air. It was more than a physical barrier. It was the boundary between the unknown freedom they so desperately sought and the dangerous future that lay beyond. She nodded at the creature. "Go." The creature didn't need any further encouragement. With a sharp strike, it shattered the glass, sending a shower of shards clattering to the floor. Mia winced, but there was no time for caution now. She scrambled to help the creature clear the rest of the window frame. As soon as the hole was large enough, Mia climbed through, the creature following with a single, fluid motion. They were outside. The night air hit her with an intensity that stole her breath. It was cool and crisp, filled with the faint hum of distant machinery and the occasional shriek of alien wildlife. The landscape stretched out before them. Rocky terrain, dark hills, and a barren expanse that seemed to go on forever. Mia took a few steps away from the building, looking over her shoulder at the structure they had just escaped. The Braction's fortress loomed behind them, cold and menacing, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Mia felt the stirrings of hope. "We made it," she breathed. The creature stood beside her, its massive form outlined against the starlit sky. It turned its gaze toward her, and for a brief moment, it seemed almost human. She exhaled, forcing herself to focus on what came next. "Now we need to move. We can't waste time." The creature rumbled in agreement, its eyes locking onto the horizon. Together, they started moving, the weight of their escape settling into their bones. But Mia knew this was just the beginning. They had no idea what dangers lay ahead, what forces the Braction would send after them. But for the first time, the odds seemed a little less stacked against them. They had each other, and that might just be enough to change the course of everything.